Furthermore, it's not just that industrialization has played a role in sustained convergence after the Second World War. It's also that when you look at the origins of the initial divergence, what happened in the Industrial Revolution is that industrialization also played deindustrialization played a very important role there too, because this is data from Paul Byrock, which is, it's not that just that the advanced countries industrialized. What's striking is that also the then developing countries, the countries that were going to be left behind, actually experienced deindustrialization. So that countries like China and India, which had some craft industries, those craft industries were decimated, and they were, of course, as we know, sort of this, the first division of labor. They became primary producers and lost whatever little manufacturing industry that they had. So this is sort of historical, fairly broad-brushed evidence on the role that industrialization has played, alongside with the more formal statistical evidence in industrialization being a particularly important escalator industry. So how do we sort of put that together with the conditional convergence story? So a minimal framework would be like this, which is that we can basically think of growth being driven by three kinds of channels. The first one of these is the conditional convergence process, so that this depends on the accumulation of basic capabilities, and I said fundamentally these are things like human capital and institutional quality. Now, the main claim I would make with respect to this sort of fundamental channel, the conditional convergence channel, is that it's a slow process. Every bit of evidence that we have across countries on this suggests that the mapping between the accumulation of fundamental capabilities and growth is a very slow one. That is to say that, for example, with respect to human capital, we find that the level of human capital affects growth, but we don't find that the accumulation of human capital drives growth. So you're trying to get growth out of investing more in education, you're not going to get a whole lot out of it. With respect to institutional quality, we know that institutional quality is linked with levels of long-run income. But try to run a regression on the change in institutional quality, that is the improvements in institutions and growth, and you get very weak results at best. So there is something about how theta gets transformed into the steady state level of income, or how that in turn affects growth through the catch-up parameter gamma, is that this is a slow and painful process that is fundamental for long-run growth, but you don't rely on it to get Asian-style growth. You don't get 4%, 5% kind of growth out of this channel. Okay, it's still fundamental. It's still what drives long-run growth, but this is not a channel for rapid long-run convergence. The second channel is the one that I showed you with the scatter plots, which is the process of unconditional convergence in the modern or formal manufacturing parts of the world, and there, of course, is unconditional. That is to say, it'll take place regardless of your level of education, your institutional quality, your geography, right? That's what's striking and surprising about unconditional convergence. But the problem is that even though sort of the second half of that term is fairly large, because beta is about 3%, and a country that sort of could be very far away from the frontier. The problem is that it's all pre-multiplied by alpha m, and alpha m is the employment share of manufacturing, or to be more precise, the employment share of formal manufacturing in the developing countries, and that's going to be very, very low. In a typical African country, it's less than 5%. So no matter how big a force that is, as long as you have only 5% of your labor force in the most modern parts of your economy, you don't get a big kick out of convergence in manufacturing for the aggregate economy. So that, again, for most low-income countries actually doesn't kick in, doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Where we get, in fact, we might get a big kick is actually through the structural change channel or through reallocation channel. That is that as labor moves from the lower to higher productivity parts of the economy, where these pi m is the modern sector's relative productivity, pi t is the traditional sector's relative productivity. And because in these low-income countries that's going to be a big gap between pi m and pi t, you get a very big kick from growth typically for a few decades out of this relocation. And you can sort of quantitatively work these out, and you can find that the channel C is going to be very key. So the reason that unconditional convergence in manufacturing therefore matters is that unconditional convergence ensures that manufacturing productivity is always on a higher productivity level. And if you can kick in sufficient structural change, sufficient cross-industrialization, labor moving from the rest of the economy into modern industry, that's what's going to give you very rapid growth and very rapid convergence over time, rather than channels A and B. So the answer to why don't we get very rapid convergence, as I said, is that first the alpha, the manufacturing share is very, very small, and also that this industrialization process typically takes place very, very slowly, despite very large productivity gaps between manufacturing and the rest of the economy. Just let me show you a little bit about what's been happening recently in this very high growth phase of the world economy in sub-Saharan Africa, to sort of see precisely with respect to these things what's been happening. So this is the sub-Saharan African case, and just look at manufacturing. And if you want, just look at the period between 1990 and 2010. And what do you see? Remarkably, this high growth period has been one actually where there has been deindustrialization rather than industrialization. So manufacturing, in terms of both its value added share and its employment share, has actually come down in this period. Rather than, so this wasn't a period, this wasn't growth that was being driven by industrialization at all. And furthermore, it's not just that, these numbers are actually include both formal and informal manufacturing. If we look at the difference between formal and informal, and this is one way of looking at it is by comparing the UNIDO data, which is only formal, more or less, and the previous set of data, which also come from population censuses and household censuses. What you see is that the ratio, which is the last column, which is the share of total manufacturing employment that is informal, parts of that is formalized, is extremely low, with just a few exceptions like Botswana, Mauritius, and South Africa, and Zambia. In all of the countries, like in Senegal, it's only 6%. In Ghana, it's about 9%. So it's not just that manufacturing is small and it's getting smaller. It's also that the parts, the organized parts of it, the formal parts of it, are so small. Which is, I think, why what we see in Africa during this period of rapid growth is that not just we're not getting the industrialization, it's actually the overall productivity level in African manufacturing has been falling behind, which seems, on the face of it, inconsistent with the convergence story that I've told you. But I think it's consistent with the fact that so much of the African manufacturing is actually informal, small scale, operates not with modern technologies and so forth. So, the question is, just to return to my title, then what are the alternative paths to high growth? So if, in fact, channel C is one that has been in the past the key to very rapid growth, East Asian style growth, but that going forward, it's unlikely to, I think I skipped one. No, I didn't, well, yeah, there was a missing chart here, which was meant to show that this process of deindustrialization is actually not just specific to Africa, that pretty much around the world, countries are beginning to deindustrialize at much lower levels of income than has been the case historically, okay? Which is sort of another reason why to discount the likely quantitative effect of C going forward. So that leaves the other two, A and B. So one broad set of strategies would be to think about how we can enhance the growth payoffs of investments in basic capability. So, Philippe will later tell us about services, I believe. David will talk about human capital, right? So the issue is how much do they can increase the overall the growth payoffs, and can they be sufficiently large? And the second logical possibility is, of course, to expand the range of industries that have escalator properties. So I've talked about them as formal manufacturing, because that's where we have the data, that's where we see the evidence more clearly. But perhaps there are non-traditional agricultural crops, perhaps there are some services that have simultaneously the ability to absorb significant amounts of labor, like traditional standardized manufacturing historically has, and also has the productivity growth properties of those industries, that they produce this kind of escalator effect. Now, people talk about IT and other things, but of course IT has the disadvantage that it really cannot absorb a lot of the economy's human capital because of the mismatch between the kind of labor demand IT and services require and the fundamental labor skill composition of those economies. But maybe there are other service industries. But I think if we want to talk about sustained rapid convergence, these are the kinds of things that we'll have to be talking about, and much less about industrialization per se. So that's the sense in which I do think we're moving to a new kind of era where industrialization will play much less of a role. And the question is whether there is a new growth model that will come with this new era that will generate similar levels of growth as in the growth champions of the past. So just let me stop here. Basic points. I do think growth has been unsustainable due to temporary circumstances. I do think convergence will continue, by the way, but that's as much because the rich countries will be growing less than as the fact that poor countries will have very high growth rates. And I think as increasingly domestic rather than global trends drive growth, I think once again we're going to be seeing an increase in heterogeneity across the developing world in terms of their growth performance, because it will be much more local circumstances that drive that growth. Let me stop there.